Welcome to Partners in Economic Development with your host, Robert Santee.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Santee. I'm president of the Connecticut Economic Resource Center, and I want to welcome you to our program today on Brownfields redevelopment. It's one of a series of economic development programs brought to you by the Four-Town Partnership. The Four-Town Partnership was formed by the economic development corporations of the towns of Orange, Shelton, Naugatuck, and Hamden. And of course, I want to thank our sponsors for the show, the United Illuminating Corporation and Northeast Utilities. Our topic today is Brownfields redevelopment, and I want to put it in perspective. One of the things that the Connecticut Economic Resource Center does is research on Connecticut's economy. And what we've found over the last 20 years is there's been very little growth of jobs and population in Connecticut. And there's also an anti-growth feeling in many of our towns, with people not happy with the way their towns have developed over the last 30 years. And yet we know we have to have job growth, we need to have economic growth if we're going to provide our citizens with the things that they want. So we need to find out how to grow. We want to be able to create jobs, we want to be able to provide health care for our citizens, we want quality early childhood education. All of these things cost money. And if we're going to be able to provide them, then you need an economy that's growing. Now, how do brownfields play into this scenario? Well, if people are unhappy with the pattern of development in the state of Connecticut over the last 30 years, they're worried about the loss of green space, then it seems to make sense that we should reuse properties in our urban areas or properties that have environmental contamination. And you know, what's happened in Connecticut is that as we've shifted from a manufacturing economy to a more service-oriented economy, we've abandoned a lot of the properties that were important to manufacturing but don't serve service industries well. As a matter of fact, between 1963 and 2006, we lost 227,000 manufacturing jobs in Connecticut. And over 200,000 of those were in 24 towns that are our urban centers in Connecticut. So you can see what's happened in those towns that relied on manufacturing. So we need to take advantage of the development opportunity that brownfields provide us. Otherwise, we would have to pay for new infrastructure to service properties that in far-flung locations outside our urban centers. So that's the context in which we want to have a discussion this morning, and I'd like to thank our guests for being with us and introduce them to you. First is Graham Stevens from the Department of Environmental Protection. He has been for the last 8 years an environmental analyst with the Remediation Division of the department. And he oversees investigation and remediation projects and has in southwestern Connecticut in addition to his new responsibilities. He has a BA in environmental geography from Clark University and a Master of Science and is a candidate for a Master of Science degree in hydrogeology at UConn. Thanks for being with us, Graham.
Thanks for having me.
Our second guest is Dave Hurley. Dave is Director of Brownfields for the firm of Fuss & O'Neill. Fuss & O'Neill is a Connecticut-based multidisciplinary engineering firm with offices in Manchester and Trumbull. And Dave's been with the firm for over 20 years. Dave is a licensed environmental professional, and we're going to talk about what that means in a few minutes. He's also on the technical committee, or chairs the technical committee, of the Connecticut chapter of the National Brownfields Association, and is the chapter's liaison to Connecticut's Office of Brownfields Remediation and Development, something else we'll hear more about in a few minutes. And I want to thank Dave for being with us as well.
Thank you, Bob.
And finally, Dale Krupp, who is Director of Economic and Community Development for the town of Hamden. He has held that position for 8 years. He administers the town's business incentive and redevelopment programs, and as well as their community development programs for housing. Before joining the town of Hamden, Dale was with the firm of DiCarlo and Dahl for nearly 14 years as Director of Grants Administration and as a project manager for redevelopment projects. Thanks, all three of you, for being with us today. I think one of the interesting things about our panel is, first of all, you're all very hands-on guys. You've actually done brownfields redevelopment, and I think that's important. But the other thing is we have someone from the state, someone from a municipality, and someone who's in the private sector that actually does brownfields redevelopment. Now, for the last 5 minutes, we've been talking about brownfields, and we haven't really defined what it is. So I'd like to start our conversation today, I guess with you, Graham, to talk a little bit about what is the definition of brownfields.
Sure, Bob. Brownfields was recently defined in 2007 in Public Act 07233, and that was defined as property where redevelopment or reuse was complicated by the presence or potential presence of environmental pollution on the site. The definition is very long, but it actually is very simple. You know, we all know these properties that exist in our neighborhoods and in our regions where we think it might be polluted. It's either underutilized or no one is buying the site and redeveloping it. And this is the term that we have for brownfields.
In practice every day, Dave, how does that definition apply to the work that you do?
Well, the definition of the brownfield sites, as Graham said, basically are sites that are not being redeveloped because of the perception that the contamination is going to add to the cost or complicate the redevelopment of the properties. And we see these sites located both in areas where they have good potential redevelopment potential because of their location and size and so forth. But we're also finding them in areas in our urban centers where they're within residential and communities and so forth. They could be a very small site like a former gasoline station or former auto body facility, for instance. And to some extent now the EPA has expanded their definition of a brownfield to include crack houses and so forth. So we do find brownfields are located in area wherever there's been historic development and historic, particularly industrial activity.
I suppose people that don't have a regular working knowledge of this think of it as the large factories along 95 in Bridgeport and New Haven. Dale, that doesn't apply to a lot of the brownfields that you have in Hamden. Is there a typical brownfield in Hamden?
No, there really isn't. A lot of them you'll find that some of the sites that Dave referred to, very often something's just perceived to be a brownfield. It actually is just blighted. But whether it's statutorily defined as a brownfield or something just perceived as public, it's a concern for people who would want to invest in your community, and it's also a concern to taxpayers who live in these neighborhoods. We have little block buildings, we have contaminated fields, we have just a few abandoned gas stations, but they're all different kinds of dirty sites.
Well, that gets, I guess, into the question of why clean them up. If you have a site that's in a residential neighborhood, as an example, people probably have a concern about safety or the contamination that might be on the site. Why is it important to clean up these sites?
Well, to broaden the answer a little bit to the whole community, I think all communities kind of struggle to maintain the quality of life and a balance between open space, residential areas, and of course have a legitimate amount of commercial area for development. In Hamden, the challenge is that we have about 12% of our land that's zoned commercial, and that's a huge challenge. Ultimately, we're trying to stabilize taxes, maintain property values, hopefully they go up, and we do this very often under the current system by trying to create more tax revenue, of course, and then job creation. And then we do that by trying to retain the businesses and help them grow that are currently in Hamden, and also to recruit where we can. But it all leads back to the fact that we have 12% of our land zoned for commercial, and we have to try to redevelop that property, and almost all of our brownfields are in that 12%.
Yeah. Let's talk a minute about the significance of that 12%. You talked about taxes and raising tax revenue. What's the alternative to reusing these properties when it comes to taxes and paying for public services?
Well, these properties could be used for some public uses. A lot of them were formerly on what used to be a rail line, which 100 years ago, that's how commerce was done in Hamden. There's not that many alternatives but to make them commercial uses.
Yeah, I guess from a typical residential taxpayer's point of view, they would rather see these properties redeveloped and have the taxes go to the town than see their mill rate go up.
Absolutely, and notice I didn't say our job is to lower taxes. I said that our job is to stabilize taxes.
Create revenues so the town can provide the services.
That's the system that we're working in. It's not. There's many alternatives to that system. I know we can discuss, but that is certainly what we're working with today.
Yeah, Graham, maybe you could talk a little bit about the health and environmental impacts of brownfields and why it's important to clean them up from that perspective.
Well, from the state's perspective, the Department of Environmental Protection has a mission to protect human health and the environment. So any brownfield site that goes through the process of an investigation and a cleanup is obviously going to reduce the risks to people in the neighborhood, the environment, whether it be river environments, or protects the drinking water resources that many towns utilize in Connecticut for their drinking purposes. So there's obviously a benefit there when a brownfield is cleaned up. The other is more of a social benefit. You know, if you have this blighted property in your neighborhood and you have the fear of the contamination, that's obviously something that can adversely affect people. When this site is returned to productive use, you know, the community has a better self-respect and you know, has issues with people's you know, concerns for their safety as well.
Mm-hmm. Dave, maybe you could talk from a private sector standpoint. Some of the clients you work with, why are they interested in brownfields as opposed to other types of development?
Well, they're interested because of the location of the brownfields. A real estate development project is largely based on the actual location of the site and the market for that site. And typically what has happened in Connecticut is that as our inner core areas of our smaller communities that were developed as a mill town, for instance, and then we had residential development around it, or our larger urban centers, the manufacturing was close nearby and close to our urban centers. And as these areas have been abandoned, they've actually inhibited the development of those communities. Now, the developing community is seeing those areas as key or prime areas from a real estate perspective. They're close to the highways, close to the major arteries and so forth, and the utilities are in place, so that the potential value for the brownfields is very high. I would also add that I think that from a community development point of view, one of the things that our communities are struggling with is to be able to have housing for young professionals so that we can attract industry and business to Connecticut. And in order to do that, they need to create a vibrant atmosphere close to those jobs where young people can enjoy the lifestyle and an urban lifestyle. And we've seen that in a lot of the other cities around the country that have sort of experienced a rebirth. And in order to do that, we really do need to undertake redevelopment of those brownfield sites in those urban centers.
Yeah, I mentioned in our opening that you know, we've shifted from manufacturing to services, and a lot of the development over the last 30 years has really gone to suburban locations on what's sometimes referred to as greenfields. So there is a choice that developers have as to which sites they decide to develop, and you've given us a good understanding of why the location is important. Graham, maybe you could talk a little bit about other differences between brownfield and greenfield development and what the real differences are.
Well, one of the major differences, in my opinion, between greenfields and brownfields is that greenfields are an area that the state wants to try to protect. Recently, the governor has signed Executive Order 15, calling for a new policy for responsible growth. And here we're trying to protect the character of Connecticut. You know, businesses and people tend to locate here because you have vibrant cities and villages, as well as the pastoral areas of Connecticut, which is a major attribute. So if we are able to redevelop our brownfields, we add vibrancy to these urban and village areas and preserve the open green space for, you know, future generations to come.
So it's really two sides of the same coin. You can protect important environmental assets and develop where the infrastructure is already in place.
And that's correct. But a lot of these greenfields are also areas where we want to conserve the natural resources that are often associated with these greenfields.
Dave, Graham mentioned Executive Order 15, which was the governor's responsible growth executive order. We toss these phrases out a lot: smart growth, responsible growth. Can you talk for a minute about what those phrases mean and why Brownfields is an important part of that?
Well, the concept of smart growth or responsible growth is to have sustainable development in areas where the resources are already established, such as mass transportation, highways, infrastructure, and so forth. When we discuss green development, we're talking about having additional development out in pristine areas. Now, there's a cost associated with both of them in terms of, or different factors associated with the development. In the greenfield areas, we still may be taxing resources of the community and the state to bring services and to bring utilities and so forth out to new areas, new roads, new sewer hookups, and so forth. Whereas in the urban areas, there may be dealing with the historic contamination and so forth, which is where Brownfields is key in the responsible growth redevelopment, because the brownfield sites are typically located in these areas that have a historical legacy. Connecticut was a fundamental, in the area of the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in America. And so we have sites that have had manufacturing on them since before the Civil War. And so there are have been various historic uses of those properties, and so and they typically have been in our urban centers, and so those areas that are brownfields are key to the redevelopment according to smart growth principles.
So actually, brownfields redevelopment is more important to Connecticut than maybe some other areas of the country because of our early industrial
by all
history.
means. Yes.
We probably put more pressure on development of the greenfields properties because of that early industrial.
Well, yes, the
experience.
natural inclination is for development to occur away from these areas because of the concerns about the environmental conditions of the properties. For a number of factors, developers and communities have wrestled with what to do with the properties because of the technical challenges.
Yeah, I think people probably wonder what's an appropriate reuse of some of these properties. And, it seems that there are all sorts of projects being done on brownfields. One I know I'm familiar with in Hamdendale is a multiple-use project that includes housing.
Right, and this notion of reusing existing infrastructure is really critical for communities like Hamden that are largely built out now. We have a project that combined 4 or 5 different sites. It wasn't terribly polluted. We had about 4 or 5 underground oil tanks, a building with a lot of lead and asbestos, and all of that is being dealt with as part of the site development and the development of a mixed-use project, which will be 27 affordable artist housing units and about 18,000 square feet of commercial space. They'll be using 2 historic buildings that are both loaded with lead and asbestos, but also they're going. The positive side is they're going to keep the design so that it accentuates the historic value of those buildings, but also they'll be building some new construction. So it's about an $8 million project, but they're taking 4 blighted properties that had varying levels of contamination on them and turning them around and using the existing infrastructure on a bus line in close proximity to several institutions in the greater New Haven area. And we're really excited about this project that will begin in the spring of this year.
It's also located on the Farmington Canal line, so as people are looking at commuting by bicycle or walking more as gas prices get out of range.
Yes, well, certainly to do an infomercial for our Farmington Canal Greenway, we have, I think, the longest stretch of pedestrian greenway in Connecticut, and we're going to be finishing the last 1.8 miles starting this spring. It'll take it all the way, technically all the way to downtown New Haven from northern Cheshire, actually. And that this redevelopment project is adjacent to, and we're able to kind of use all of the assets with the liabilities to make the project work.
You know, we've talked quite a bit about why we should be doing redevelopment of brownfields. We've really talked about the policies and executive order, and we may come back to that. But maybe we should talk a little bit about how you do this. I mean, we just talked about putting housing on a brownfield. And I think the audience probably is saying, gee, is that an appropriate thing to put on some piece of property that was contaminated? So I think it might be worthwhile to share with our audience how you do brownfields. And Graham, maybe you can start from the state's perspective and what role the department plays in how brownfields are redeveloped.
Okay, Bob. Well, with respect to the department's role, the department is a regulatory agency. However, brownfields is somewhat different than the typical cleanup because there are a lot of contaminated sites that are cleaned up which wouldn't be termed brownfields. You know, brownfields are a little bit different because there's often the redevelopment component tied in with the cleanup. And going to the artist housing project, you know, in Connecticut, the use will determine the cleanup. So starting from the beginning, the most important thing is conducting a good investigation, and the state can help with guiding that investigation, ensuring it's conducted properly. We've been working to put out guidance on what is a good investigation, and that can be found at our website. And once the investigation is complete, the parties will work together to develop a cleanup plan. And this is the key document that lays out the framework for what will be cleaned up, what will be left on site, whether it be capped under a building, under parking, or left at depth with some sort of land use control. So this, you know, this is the basic process of how the cleanup is done.
Yeah, so you establish standards, and if the property is going to be redeveloped, they have to redevelop it in accordance with those standards. So if it's done that way, you can give assurance to the public that any health issues or environmental issues that existed no longer exist or are managed in a way that there isn't a public health concern.
Correct. Our remediation standard regulations are what we consider the end point. So the cleanup plan is something that can be created creatively and is based on the site investigation. We can be there as the state to say that this is safe for reuse when the cleanup matches our remediation standards.
Dave, I mentioned in your introduction that you're a licensed environmental professional. I'm sure people are wondering what that is, first of all, but also how it relates to the remediation plan and the cleanup of a property. Somebody has to be looking at these cleanup standards that DEP puts out there and interpreting them. Is that part of what you do?
Yes, it is, Bob. The licensed environmental professional is a person who has been deemed qualified, and that involves continuing education, certain technical qualifications, as well as an experience, as well as pretty rigorous testing. But once you are a licensed environmental professional, the DEP has set up a program where the licensed environmental professional, acts in the stead of DEP to verify that investigations and remediations have been conducted in accordance with the remedial standards that Graham was referring to.
The standards are, I'm going to say, a living document. That might not be exactly right. But your experience in the field informs the department's standards, right? Is that fair to say?
Yes. The standards have changed as time goes on, only because the science and the particular contaminants of concern have grown over the years, and they probably will continue to. But we do work closely with DEP, and so that's an ongoing process.
DEP is a regulator. I think it's interesting, though, that in this instance you actually get into redevelopment, and we can talk about the relationship with other departments as far as that's concerned. Dave, you actually interpret the standards and help a client to meet the standards.
That's correct.
Dale, I'd be interested in knowing what the town's role is. This is a complicated activity. I assume that the town, that's the host of any one of these properties, has to sort of convene meetings and collaborate with everybody in getting this stuff done. Is that what you do?
Well, that's a small part of what we do, but the bigger part of what we do is really to a variety of things, one of which is to raise capital for remediation. In the case of a children's museum that I worked on with Graham a few years ago, we had to use some state funding to work towards the remediation of the site. Some of the work had been done previously on a former abandoned gas station. So our role was really to take the funding that was available and apply it and manage the project as much as it was convening people. There was a lot of convening going on because there was a protracted negotiation and some conflict resolution. I used my social work degree, Bob, for that, I think. But we were able to use funding creatively to pay for environmental insurance. And what we ended on this particular project, which was the Eli Whitney Museum, was a children's museum on a polluted site. But it took lots of different kinds of skills that we had to use, from project management to fundraising. The other roles that we play vary depending on the project, but we also are like our educators at the local level. We're working with our land use commissions. Most of the time they don't have the background that, let's say, Dave has. So we have to educate them as to what's really contaminated, what's just perceived to be contaminated. We're working with neighbors and residents and other businesses that are concerned about the depth of the problem, not to use a pun there, but and we're also arm twisters to get people to work together, and that's not social work skills. That's just it's common sense, getting people to work together. Mm-hmm. Variety of things.
I would also add, Bob, that our experience working with the municipalities versus the developers is that the municipalities are often the ones who have to deal with the most upside-down properties. The properties that are not so easy to redevelop, the properties that are in locations that may not have the highest economic redevelopment potential, but at the same time they have a strong potential, they have a strong impact on the community. So the municipality has to struggle with raising the funding to lift those sites up to a level where they are at a level playing field for redevelopment.
So in many instances, maybe not all, redevelopment of a brownfield is a much more expensive undertaking than finding a greenfield somewhere and building on it.
It often can be, yes.
Yeah.
And the one of the main reasons for that is the cost of the environmental investigations and remediation.
Right. And we've talked about the fact that and you were intimating also, that if it's an important property in a community, even if the contamination is horrific and it's going to be very expensive, sometimes the public policy goal is to get that property cleaned up because it's so important to the growth of that whole neighborhood and possibly the whole community.
Yes, and these sites, if they're left abandoned, can have a real negative impact on the community and inhibit other growth. There are stories where brownfield sites have been remediated into a park, and just by doing that, because it didn't, the community needed a park and there wasn't the commercial potential for the site, let's say. But at the same time, all of a sudden, the surrounding properties got reinvestment from the private sector and commercial development flourished around the park.
So that's a great balance between having some green space and having some redevelopment opportunities.
That's correct.
When you talk to clients about a brownfields project, what are they looking for in a comprehensive brownfields program? What do they need in order to move forward?
Well, the development community, obviously, one of their biggest concern is time, because they're putting out money for investment, and that money costs money to have out there tied up on a property. So timeliness is one of the biggest things they're always looking for. They're also very concerned with predictability, that they're going to be able to take the project through both the state process but also the local approval process. And Those are probably the two biggest factors. The other thing I think is that they're looking for certainty that they'll reach an end point. There are a lot of technical issues with environmental remediation, and those are viewed as challenges. They're not the typical real estate. They have additional challenges that a typical real estate or greenfield development doesn't have, and so they want to know that there is going to be an end point that they can reach with the environmental regulations.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about, we've raised a number of issues here, I think, that add to the difficulty of developing brownfields. We have a little bit of a shorthand, I suppose, where we group these issues into three categories. There are liability issues, there are funding issues, and there are regulatory issues. And we've talked a little bit about the regulatory role. You just mentioned the liability, and of course funding we've talked about. Some of it's public funding, some of it is private, by the way. The first thing you do under the Connecticut statutes is look for a responsible party to bear the cost of the cleanup of these properties. If there is a property owner who was responsible for the contamination on the property, the first thing you want is that responsible party to pay for it. Unfortunately, in many instances, those responsible parties are no longer available, no longer out there, so it comes to the public to pay for some of these costs. But there are a whole series of issues. Dale, I thought I'd start with you to talk a little bit about what makes brownfields redevelopment difficult, and then maybe we can talk about what the state has done to try and ease some of those problems.
Sure. I think some of the 3 or 4 issues that we generally run into, first of all, site access, getting into a property, being able to really take a look at what's going on. Again, a lot of the properties we deal with have a myriad of problems. But we need to take a look at what we're dealing with, and then we have to assess and remediate the problem, and that runs into where we're going to get the money to do that. There tends to be a fair amount of money available for doing site assessments, but depending on the type of problem that you run into, whether it's demolition of a building or remediation of just bad dirt, the source of funding often is elusive, or you have to piece together lots of different sources of funding. The last thing that we find with typical brownfield projects are all of the other host of issues that you find on a blighted property. For example, a lot of taxes owed to the community. We have cases where we have $700,000, $800,000 owed. That person's never going to pay those taxes, or that person has disappeared a long time ago. You may have mortgages and liens related to financing, other kinds of financing that were done in different eras. Let's say the 1980s is a great example, when a lot of loans were being made on dirty properties. And then you have the bizarre things. I'm dealing with one now, just to give you a quick synopsis. There's about $250,000 in taxes owed. There's about a $700,000 cleanup. It's only an 8,000 square foot building, but wait, it's 31% located in the city of New Haven and 69% located in Hamden. So how do you resolve that problem? So these are the kinds of things we run into even beyond just the contamination issue.
The state has, even before the governor's executive order, had a series of programs, both from a regulatory standpoint and a funding standpoint, and has started looking and dealing with the liability issue as well. Dave, maybe you could talk a little bit. I know you're the liaison to the Office of Brownfield Remediation and Development. Some of the programs that have been put in place to help brownfield redevelopers in Connecticut.
Well, there have been a number of different programs that have evolved, and at the same time, right now, more recently, there's been new legislation to address brownfields. Historically, the state has had a program of the Urban Sites Act, where the state provided funding and investigation services for investigation and remediation of brownfield sites that mostly had a significant economic impact to the state. In addition, the Connecticut Development Authority has a program that provides grants for remediation to developers at sites, and it utilizes the change in the property tax values from a site that's been blighted and underutilized to the new property taxes that it will generate once the site is cleaned up. And in that case, the municipality is actually paying back a loan to the CDA to provide money for that grant. So it's and as in most of these cases of brownfield redevelopment, one thing that's key is the public-private partnership, and that's an example of one. Mm-hmm. The state also has the SCRIF loan program, which is a low-interest loan fund that's available for addressing environmental assessments and asbestos surveys and so forth, as well as some demolition costs. And that loan program is available for both the private sector and the municipalities. Mm-hmm. Now, recently, the legislature appointed a task force to look at this issue, and they've met last year in 2006, 2007, and then 2007 to 2008, and they've issued reports each year, and those reports are available at the website for the OBRD, the Office of Brownfield Remediation and Development. Those reports make recommendations, and the legislature has been passing some legislation addressing the recommendations of those reports. Last year, a new funding program was established that made money available to municipalities that could then apply the money, also loan the money to private developers for all the costs associated with and dealing with the environmental conditions on the site, from the initial studies to the remediation. This year there is pending legislation that may set up additional funding mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Graham, you represent a state agency, regulatory agency, but you also work with the federal Environmental Protection Agency as well.
Correct.
I think people who have a passing understanding of these things probably think of Superfund sites and large sites, and we've already talked about the fact that the definition is much broader than that. But could you talk a little bit about the relationship with EPA and some of the things that DEP and EPA do?
Sure. Well, one of the things, obviously, EPA and the Department of Environmental Protection have a regulatory history. And we have a lot of experience on contaminated site investigation and cleanup from the regulatory angle. However, the term brownfields has come up recently, and like Dave said, Connecticut was out in front here. We had the Urban Site Remedial Action Program in 1996, which was one of the first brownfield programs in the country. Mm-hmm. We've seen that brownfields are sites that tend to get cleaned up quickly and efficiently. So we're trying to put our resources into these projects, not only because of the benefits from the responsible growth side, but also the benefits to the public health and the environment. So we work with EPA, who also has offices dealing with strictly brownfields. We're trying to separate the regulatory from the brownfield work because, like Dave also said, there are a lot of public-private partnerships, and we want to ensure the development community and the municipalities that we're here to help, that we want to be at the table to discuss the development projects, to lend our advice on how best to manage, to work through the regulatory programs. EPA has several brownfield grants and loans available, which work very well for municipalities because they can apply for these, and municipalities may have the latitude of having more time on their hands to implement the project. And I work with EPA in managing these grants and loans to municipalities.
Dave, you've worked with a lot of the EPA programs. Can you give us a little bit of a rundown on what type of resources EPA makes available?
Yes, EPA makes their programs are competitive across the country, and the Northeast has done very well relative to those programs, and primarily because we do have the historical industrial activities so that there are a number of, we have a lot of sites and a lot of communities that are impacted by brownfields. The EPA provides grants to communities or regional agencies for assessments. Historically, those have been in the amount of about $200,000 per grant for a 2-year period. They also provide cleanup grants, again, for $200,000, and those are based on an individual project, whereas the assessment grants can be based on a town-wide or region-wide program. And then they have a revolving loan fund grant, which is much more sizable, $1 million per entity, and those funds are available for loaning to private entities, or other eligible entities like municipalities. And if the money is also going to either a nonprofit or a municipal entity or government entity, they may be able to be, some of that may be granted rather than a loan. There are a few of those in the state. There's one that exists for the city of Hartford that the city of Hartford received a number of years ago. The Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development recently received an award for one, and that's available. That grant is available for loans across the whole state. Mm-hmm. And the Regional Growth Partnership for the Metropolitan New Haven area has received one. So there is money from EPA out there that is also helping the communities to particularly provide seed money so that that money can then be leveraged for private investment and other state funding.
Can I throw in
Sure,
a couple other sources also to, we've used a lot of the programs that David's been mentioning. We also use State Department of Economic and Community Development funds under Urban Act and Manufacturers Assistance Act as a tool towards the redevelopment of brownfields. I think we were talking about the Eli Whitney Museum before. We use Manufacturer Assistance Act funds for environmental insurance, which had never been done before up to that point. We've taken down, demolished buildings with Urban Act funds, and these may not always be the pollution cleanup, but may be important part of the redevelopment of the project itself.
You know, we've been talking about a lot of agencies and a lot of programs, and I hope all of the audience is not madly writing things down. We'll have numbers that you can use to access some of these informations at the end of the program. But one of the things that strikes me is we've talked about the regulatory role of the Department of Environmental Protection, and then we're talking just now about a funding role that the Department of Economic and Community Development plays. But probably the most important thing from the state's standpoint is the fact that we've created an office where both of the agencies try and meld their more traditional goals, yours being, Graham, a more regulatory role, and the Department of Economic and Community Development being development, understanding that Brownfields is uniquely where these things come together. Can you talk a little bit about how you work with the Department of Economic and Community Development in order to get Brownfields redeveloped, not just cleaned up?
Absolutely, and well put. Well, I tend to say I work with the Office of Brownfield Remediation and Development because that's even a little bit separate from the Department of Economic and Community Development. The task force, the legislative task force on brownfields, saw this same issue back in 2006, and that is why they created the Office of Brownfield Remediation and Development, and they housed that within DECD. Now there are some issues. Some people talk about silo issues in government, and brownfields does cross many agencies. There's involvement from the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Economic and Community Development, the Connecticut Development Authority, the Department of Public Health, obviously the Department of Environmental Protection. One of the things that the state has done is we've signed a memorandum of understanding where the 4 state agencies that work on brownfields have all agreed to work together through this OBRD office to get these projects done. And we've been meeting regularly to deal with these issues and try to coordinate more, because these are issues that require sometimes substantial coordination, And when you're trying to coordinate with multiple state agencies, sometimes the time factor can come into play, and that's where the brownfield projects can get hung up, and developers can become frustrated and say, well, maybe next time I won't develop a brownfield project. That's not what the state wants. We want to show that we can be nimble and we can be helpful. And with respect to the funding issue, we talked about a lot of different funding sources. OBRD is there to wade through all of those issues. We know where all the state funding is. We want people to say, I need funding, not I need funding from this pot or this pot. And we want to be able to figure out exactly where the money is going to come from. And that is the new strategy at the state for brownfield funding.
So it really is, to use a hackneyed phrase, but a one-stop shop for a brownfield redeveloper. They can call the Office of Brownfields Remediation and Development and get access to and understand the regulatory context and the funding context.
Yeah, OBRD pulls in every agency and subsets of agencies that would be necessary to accomplish that brownfield redevelopment. So in fact, it is a one-stop shop, and I think that was language that was actually used in the Public Act that created that office. That's exactly what we want. We don't want people to be confused on where they go and who they need to talk to and which funds they need to know about and ask for. We want to take some of the mystery out of brownfield redevelopment.
And when the legislature created this office, it also created a liaison role for the National Brownfields Association. And Dave, you play that. You are the liaison between the National Brownfields Association's Connecticut chapter and the office.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how it's going and how this has changed the state's role in brownfields redevelopment?
Well, the state, the creation of OBRD really has, as Graham was saying, is doing a lot to coordinate everything between the different agencies. The office is also interested in getting the input from the private sector in terms of how they can best develop both programs and streamline processes within their office as well as within the different departments that they deal with. And so having a liaison from the National Brownfield Association is part of that effort. The NBA is very active in this area, as its name would imply, and its membership includes professionals, development companies, and municipalities, so the various different stakeholders involved. In addition, the OBRD and the liaisons have provided technical support to the task force as it's been looking at these issues over the last 2 years, both in how things do operate at the state, as well as providing technical assistance in support of alternatives to improve things. And OBRD really has that in its mission from the enabling legislation to be continuously looking at ways of streamlining processes at the state.
You know, we've talked quite a bit about funding, and we've talked about the standards under which brownfields are cleaned up. We also mentioned that liability is an issue in brownfields cleanup. Can you, Dave, tell us a little bit about what the liability issues are here and how they play out?
Certainly. And the liability issues concern both the municipalities and the private sector. From the point of view of someone who is looking at a property that has had a history of manufacturing and has potential for contamination, obviously there are regulatory responsibilities associated with that property, and there are also the potential that that property may have had an impact on the environment in general. So there can be a tremendous amount of uncertainty if there isn't much known about a site. So that's sort of an open-ended liability, and that is a major hurdle to these sites, that someone takes a look at this site and they recognize the fact that I really don't know how much potentially I'm responsible for if I own the property. And that's why it's very important for the public and private partnerships to work together, because through various tools, different entities can be looking and to investigate the site. The other thing is the sites may have, as I said, it may have impacted the environment, and so therefore it may historically have affected waterways in the area. There may have been waste disposed of off-site and so forth. Under both federal law, under the provisions of what's referred to as CERCLA, the owner of properties has been responsible for the historical liability that a property may have generated. Now, in 2002, Congress enacted which was signed into law, the Brownfields bill, the modifications to CERCLA, and under that law, they changed the liability scheme, and they also provided some ongoing funding mechanisms for brownfields. With regard to the liability, what it did was it established a status or a defense for a status for a entity that wanted to purchase a contaminated site, that if they met certain conditions, and those conditions were fairly straightforward, then they were free of the liabilities under CERCLA. So this historic liability was removed under the federal program. So that has gone a good way.
And it's particularly important if you're a redeveloper who's coming in who didn't have responsibility.
That's correct.
For the contamination. So it gives you some, you said they needed some sort of surety that they know what's going to happen in the future, and that's what that was supposed to do.
That's correct. It meant that someone who had nothing to do with the historic use of the property, and who at least looked at the property and found out what they were getting themselves into, had the ability to purchase that property and not be responsible for the historic liabilities under Superfund, that property that may be attached to that property.
And the state has a program that also will provide some assurance to a redeveloper, right, Graham?
Yeah, something very similar. We have a covenant not to sue that a potential redeveloper or municipality can enter into with the state. It's a contract that basically says we know what you plan to do. So long as you fulfill that obligation, eventually we are not going to take action if additional contamination is discovered, so long as all of the appropriate actions are carried out. And this can provide some assurance to the redeveloper or the municipality that the state liability has been managed as well. So, Dave talked about the federal liability being couched, and the state liability can also be couched. And just to, for a point of the state's perspective, we love when people come to redevelop brownfield sites. Everybody wants to get these projects done. So long as municipalities and redevelopers are moving forward, the state is not looking to take action against these parties.
How does this play out from the town's perspective, Tim?
Well, a lot of these regulations that have been enacted and a lot of the policies that are in place are very helpful to the community. And they are also helpful to organizations such as our economic development corporations that become a part of redevelopment. We've talked a lot about redevelopers in terms of the real estate developer community, but the corporations like in Shelton, Naugatuck, Orange, and Hamden, to talk about the four town, play a role in this, and all of these regulations and so forth are helpful to us. It also gives us comfort as a tool. Dave mentioned tools. It's an excellent point, opportunity to bring up the corporations. A lot of these corporations were formed to take on the properties that traditional developers were not going to get involved in, even with all of the assurances that they're not going to be blamed for something. The properties that just have a myriad of problems. A corporation can take the town out of liability if they, for example, were assigned a tax lien. So the town didn't have to take title by doing a strict foreclosure. So we are another tool that would utilize a lot of these opportunities in the law to take title and to deal with these properties. And just to mention one thing, for example, that happened last summer, and the commissioner was good enough to support a bill that offers covenants not to sue to individual board members of economic development corporations at no cost. Anybody can get a covenant not to sue meeting certain requirements, but they have to pay for that covenant not to sue very often. The corporations, we're a nonprofit corporation. We have the opportunity to protect our members through this legislation and get a covenant not to sue and the protections that we need, because we're taking on the projects that even the normal real estate market will not even deal with. So corporations play a role. We're independent. We're not the town in many cases. And it's important to point out that we're just another way of doing things for our viewing audience who are interested in them.
Well, I think one of the things that's become clear is that there are an awful lot of players and a lot of parts to this remediation, cleanup, and reuse of brownfields in Connecticut. We have just a couple of minutes, so I'd like to wrap up, first of all, by thanking Graham, David, and Dale for being with us today and providing us with their expertise. I think one of the things that I certainly come away with is that at the municipal and state level, in partnership with the private sector, there is a desire not only to clean up, but to redevelop brownfields. And we've learned quite a bit about why that should be done and how that improves the quality of life in Connecticut's communities. It's a way of providing the economic growth and engine that we need to grow Connecticut's economy, while also preserving some of the environmental resources that we have in the state and not putting pressure to develop where towns don't want development to occur. I just want to let our audience know that there will be a number of telephone numbers and websites that you can contact for further information if you're interested in more information about brownfields redevelopment, particularly for the Office of Brownfields Redevelopment and the Connecticut Economic Resource Center. One of the things that we do at CERC is provide access to business people and others through our 1-800 number for programs across the board that might help businesses grow. So we'll be happy to answer any general questions you might have and also provide you information about the economic development corporations that Dale just mentioned, who are sponsors of this program. Again, let me thank the towns of Orange, Hamden, Shelton, and Naugatuck and their economic development commissions for putting this great series on the air, and also our sponsors for today, United Illuminating Company and Northeast Utilities. And thank you all for watching.